The dog lunged before anyone could blink. 110 pounds of military canine hit the doctor so hard the man's back slammed into the medication cart, sending syringes scattering across the floor. The animal didn't bark, didn't growl. It simply locked its jaws on the man's coat and pulled. And when the ID badge ripped free and skidded across the tile, everyone in that trauma bay went dead silent. The doctor's face wasn't angry, it was afraid. And Emily Vasquez, 29 years old, 18 months into her contract at Iron Ridge Medical Center, a woman 3 senior nurses had once described as the quiet one, the one who just refills IVs. Picked up that badge, turned it over once, and felt the blood leave her face. The photo was wrong. The seal was wrong. The man standing in their ER wasn't a doctor at all. If you've made it this far, I need you to do something before this story pulls you any deeper. Drop your city in the comments below. Doesn't matter where you are. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button, follow along, and don't you dare leave before part 5, because what happens to Emily by the end of this is something I promise you won't see coming. The blizzard had been building since mid-afternoon. By 6 p.m., the Weather Service out of Juneau had upgraded it to a Category 2 winter event, which in practical terms meant nothing was flying in or out of Vantara, Alaska for the next 36 hours minimum. Highway 9, the only paved road connecting Iron Ridge Medical Center to the rest of civilization, had been closed at the county line since 4. The hospital's satellite phones were running on backup power. The generator in the East Wing had been cycling on and off since Thursday, and maintenance kept filing tickets that nobody from administration seemed to read. It was, in the words of charge nurse Dolores Pack, the worst possible night for anything to go wrong. Something went wrong at 6:47 p.m. The call came over the internal radio, not the public-facing intercom, the staff channel, crackling and urgent, requesting immediate trauma prep for multiple inbound casualties. Military personnel, nature of injuries, classified pending arrival. ETA, 4 minutes. Emily had been restocking the supply room on the second floor when she heard it. She capped the saline bag she was logging, set it on the shelf, and was moving toward the stairwell before the announcement finished. She didn't run. She walked quickly, the way people walk when they've learned that running draws attention, and attention costs time. Trauma Bay 1 was already partially staffed when she arrived. Dr. Marcus Hall, the senior attending on overnight rotation, was pulling on gloves and issuing instructions about blood draws and imaging sequencing. Dolores was repositioning the crash cart. 2 other nurses Emily didn't know well, Renata and a travel nurse named Briggs, were prepping IVs. Emily moved to the secondary station near the wall, checked the defibrillator charge, confirmed the airway kit was complete, and said nothing. Dr. Hall glanced over his shoulder. Vasquez, good. You're on observation tonight. Renata's primary. Understood, Emily said. Renata shot her a quick look. Not unkind, but territorial in the way people get when they've been working a unit for 3 years and someone quieter keeps showing up to their traumas. Emily looked away first. That was a habit she'd built carefully, over time, for reasons that had nothing to do with deference. The ambulance bay doors blew open at 6:51. 4 men came through on 2 stretchers, with 3 more walking under their own power, and behind them, on a short tactical lead held by a man in a cold-weather military jacket, a Belgian Malinois with a tactical vest and alert eyes that were cataloging the room faster than most humans could blink. The dog's name, Emily would learn later, was Kodiak. The men were Navy. She could tell from the cut of the cold weather gear, from the particular way they moved even injured. Compressed, deliberate, the kind of physical economy that doesn't come from a gym. The 2 on stretchers were the critical ones. One with a GSW to the left thigh, the other with blast trauma to his right side that had cracked at least 2 ribs and done something to his breathing that wasn't fully resolved. The man holding Kodiak's lead was the healthiest of the group. Mid-30s, jaw set, dark circles under his eyes that weren't from tonight. He scanned the trauma bay the way people scan rooms when they're used to rooms containing threats. "Who's the attending?" he asked. "That's me." Dr. Hall stepped forward. "Dr. Marcus Hall, I need you to secure that animal outside the treatment area." "Kodiak stays," the man said. "Not a negotiation." Hall looked at him for a moment. This is a sterile Kodiak. Stays. The man's voice didn't rise, it just landed. He's a working asset, and he doesn't leave my team. Dolores glanced at Emily. Emily kept her eyes on the patient with the rib fractures. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and the color in his lips was a shade too pale. Tension pneumothorax was the worst case, though it hadn't fully declared yet. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, counted the rate without moving her lips, and filed the number. Renata was already starting the IV line on the GSW patient. Briggs was cutting away the second man's jacket. Dr. Hall had redirected to the most critical case, talking through vitals with the paramedic who'd come in with them, a civilian contractor from Vantara Fire, a woman named Dietz, who had the look of someone who'd been awake for 20 hours and was still sharper than most people on a full night's sleep. The second wave of activity came in behind them. A man Emily hadn't noticed initially, moving through the ambulance bay doors separately from the SEAL team, wearing a white coat over civilian clothes, an Iron Ridge Medical Center badge clipped to his breast pocket, moving with the loose confidence of someone who belonged there. Emily didn't know his face. That wasn't unusual. The hospital had 40-some physicians across departments, and she hadn't worked long enough to memorize all of them. Trauma medicine ran on a rotating cast, but something about his timing was slightly off. He'd come in behind the military transport rather than emerging from inside the hospital, and his coat was dry despite the fact that the ambulance bay was coated in wind-driven snow. She filed that too. Vasquez, Dr. Hall's voice across the bay. Get me the chest drainage kit from storage. Second shelf, right side. Briggs can't find it. On it, she said, and turned for the storage corridor. The man in the white coat was already near the medication cabinet when Emily came back through with the drainage kit. He had his badge raised toward the electronic lock, and she noticed, the way she noticed things quietly, without breaking stride, that he pressed it twice before the light went green. The reader on that cabinet was finicky, had been for weeks, but staff who used it daily learned its particular rhythm. He hadn't. She set the kit on the table beside Dr. Hall, resumed her position, and watched. His name, according to the badge, was Dr. R. Callum. She'd never heard that name in the morning briefings, the schedule boards, the department Slack. There were 2 doctors named Callum in the regional hospital network. She knew because she'd looked up call schedules her first month here, mapping the staff structure the way she mapped every environment she entered. And neither was listed as working tonight. Could be a floater. Could be a covering physician she hadn't met. Could be nothing. The man with the rib fractures suddenly coughed and grabbed the side rail. His O2 dropped 4 points in under 30 seconds. Emily was already at his side before Briggs finished turning around. She had her hand on his wrist, counting pulse, reading the effort in his breathing muscles, watching the tracheal deviation that wasn't quite there yet but was heading there. He's decompensating, she said. Directly, not loudly. Trachea is starting to shift. You need to decompress before it declares. Dr. Hall looked up from the GSW patient. Vasquez, your observation. Renata, check his... I'm looking at it, Renata said from the other side of the bed. A pause. She might be right. He might, Emily said carefully, because she'd learned that softening her certainty bought her 30 seconds she sometimes needed. I'd want a second set of eyes on his breath sounds. Dr. Hall moved to the bed. He listened. His expression shifted, not dramatically, because Hall was not a dramatic man, but the set of his shoulders changed, and he reached for the decompression kit without further commentary. Emily stepped back. The man with Kodiak had been watching her. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of specific attention, the kind that isn't idle. When she glanced up, he wasn't looking away. She looked away first. Habit. The procedure took 11 minutes. Hall was efficient and Renata was good. Emily had always thought Renata was good. Whatever her territorial instincts, the patient's O2 climbed back to acceptable range. His breathing evened. The crisis didn't become a catastrophe. Dolores let out a breath and went to update the charge log. It was during that lull, the particular pause after an acute intervention when the room recalibrates, when attention scatters briefly before regrouping, that Kodiak moved. Emily heard it before she saw it. The shift in the dog's stance, the low sound that wasn't quite a growl, but was everything before a growl. She turned, Kodiak was staring at Dr. R. Callum, the dog's handler, the man with the dark circles, the one who'd argued about the animal staying, had his hand on the lead, but it was a loose grip. He was watching Kodiak with the particular attention of someone who has learned to trust a signal he doesn't fully understand. Callum hadn't noticed yet. He was at the medication cabinet again, and he was moving something. Not retrieving a labeled medication, not doing anything Emily could identify as standard clinical behavior, but shifting something, his body angled in a way that blocked the sightline from the central nursing station. Kodiak's handler let 2 feet of lead out. Dolores from across the room. "Someone get that animal under control, please." The dog moved. It wasn't vicious. It was precise. 110 pounds of military-trained Belgian Malinois hit Dr. Callum from behind at a 45-degree angle, driving him forward into the medication cart, scattering supplies across the floor. The dog's jaws locked onto the coat at the shoulder, and it pulled. And the badge snapped off its retractable clip and skidded 7 feet across the tile, spinning once, landing face up under the secondary light. "Get that animal off me!" Callum's voice cracked on the last word. "Kodiak, halt!" The handler's voice was flat and immediate, and the dog released and backed 3 steps, but didn't sit. Its eyes didn't leave the man on the floor. Dr. Hall's face had gone red. "What the hell is—" "I'm sorry. I'll handle him." The handler was already moving toward Kodiak, but his eyes had gone to Callum, and there was something careful in them now, something that had shifted. Emily had already picked up the badge. She didn't make a production of it. She moved toward it naturally, as if tidying up the scattered supplies, and she palmed it and turned it over in her hand and looked at it, really looked at it, under the secondary light. The photo was slightly off-center in its laminate. The Iron Ridge Medical Center crest was the right color, but the wrong weight. The ink sat on the surface rather than being embedded, the way cheap reprints always looked if you knew what real institutional printing felt like. The RFID chip housing on the back had a seam that the hospital's legitimate badges didn't have. She'd held enough identification documents in her life to know the difference between real and manufactured. She set it back on the floor near the scattered supplies, stood up, and looked at Callum, who was getting to his feet and brushing off his coat with the controlled anger of someone recalculating. "I need someone to remove that animal from this ward immediately," he said. He was talking to Dr. Hall, projecting authority, the tone of a physician who expected deference. "This is a sterile trauma environment, and that behavior is a liability issue. I'll be speaking to administration." "What's your name?" the handler said. Not loudly, quietly, which was worse. Callum turned. "Excuse me? Your name, the one on your badge." "I don't need to justify myself to—" "Callum," Dr. Hall said firmly, putting himself between the handler and the other man. "I apologize for the disruption. Let me find the charge nurse and we'll get this sorted. Can you tell me which department you're covering tonight? I don't have you on the rotation board." A beat. Too long. "Trauma consult," Callum said. "I was called in from Ridgeback Regional. The storm's been rerouting staff all night." It was plausible. It was the kind of answer that worked in a busy hospital on a bad night, vague enough to require verification, but framed in a way that made asking for that verification feel like bureaucratic obstruction. Emily had heard that particular rhetorical move before, in different contexts, in different languages, from different people. It always sounded the same. She looked at Dolores. Dolores looked back. Her expression said, "I don't know him either." "I'll pull up the Ridgeback roster," Renata said, already moving toward the nursing station. Callum's jaw tightened, barely visible. Emily saw it. Across the room, one of the walking SEAL casualties, a compact man with a bandaged forearm, dark-eyed, the one who'd been quiet since they arrived, had straightened up from where he'd been leaning against the wall. He was looking at Callum too, and the quality of that look was different from everyone else's. Less curious, more recognizing. Callum noticed. His gaze moved to the man, held there 1/2 second too long, then away. The SEAL's name, Emily would later learn, was Petty Officer 2nd Class Dario Venn. At that moment, she didn't know his name. She only knew what she saw, a trained operator who had just clocked something that everyone else in the room was still trying to catch up to. Ven looked at Emily. She gave the smallest nod. Not agreement, not confirmation of anything, just acknowledgement. She saw you. He saw her see him. Renata's voice from the nursing station. I've got the Ridgeback call roster from the last 48 hours. There's no Callum on it. The temperature in the room changed. Not literally. The hospital was cold because the East Wing generator was cycling and the heating vents were uneven tonight, as they always were during blizzards. But the temperature changed the way it changes when a group of people simultaneously reach the edge of a comfortable explanation and have to decide whether to step off it. Dr. Hall turned to face Callum fully. Something in his posture had shifted. He was still the senior attending, still the authority in this room in the clinical hierarchy, but the certainty was fraying at the edges. There may have been a clerical... There wasn't, Ven said, quietly, from the wall. Callum's expression didn't break. It reconfigured, from a fronted professional to something harder underneath, something that had been waiting behind the irritation the whole time. This is a waste of time during an active trauma, he said. I'll resolve this with administration directly. He turned toward the hallway door. The road's closed, Emily said. Her voice was conversational, not blocking him, not escalating, just noting a fact. Callum stopped, turned back part way. Highway 9's been closed at the county line since 4, she continued. Ridgeback Regional is 61 miles down that road. If you drove in from there tonight, you'd have had to leave before the closure, which would be before the trauma call came in. She paused. Hard to be called in for a consult on a case that didn't exist yet. The room was very quiet. Dr. Hall was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before, the particular look of a person who is recalculating someone they've underestimated, doing the math quickly, not quite landing on the right answer yet. Callum looked at her with something different, something that had no professional component in it at all. You're a nurse, he said. The word wasn't descriptive, it was dismissive. A category, not a person. Stay in your lane. Kodiak hadn't sat down. The dog was still on partial alert, watching the man, reading something in the room that registered on its nervous system before it registered on anyone else's. Emily said nothing. She had learned over years, and in context most people in this room could not imagine, that silence after a true statement is more dangerous to a liar than any argument. Let it sit. Let it do its work. Renata, slowly. I can call security. We're going to need to do more than that, Ven said. He'd straightened up completely off the wall, and the bandaged arm was clearly not slowing him down. He was looking at Callum with the open, unblinking attention of someone who has made an assessment and is done deliberating. I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Callum's attention moved to Ven, calculating. Operation Sandthorn, Ven said. Nobody in the room recognized the phrase. Emily kept her face still. Callum's face did something complicated and fast. A flicker, a suppression, a controlled reassembly. It lasted less than a second. Long enough. I don't know what you're... You just answered, Ven said. Callum moved. Not toward the hallway, toward the medication cabinet. His hand went to his pocket, and what came out wasn't a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a device, roughly the size and shape of a key fob, matte black, with a single indicator light that had just turned red. The lights in the East Wing flickered. Not the whole hospital, just the East Wing. The wing that housed the ICU, the ventilators, the 3 patients on continuous life support who had been in-house before the trauma team arrived. Dolores made a sound. Low, involuntary, the kind that comes before a word you can't find fast enough. Everyone stays where they are, Callum said. His voice was different now. The professional register was gone. What was under it was flat and precise and not performing anything for anyone. He held up the device. This is connected to the primary and secondary power routing for the East Ward systems. I have a 3-minute delay if I release the trigger. If you move, any of you, I release it. He looked at the SEAL team. And before any of you start calculating odds, understand that there are 4 of you who can't walk and 1 of you who's running on a chest tube. So let's all be reasonable. There are patients on those systems, Dr. Hall said. His voice was shaking in a way he couldn't control. Those are people on life support. I'm aware, Callum said. He looked at Emily. You, he said, move to the wall, away from the supply cabinet. She didn't move immediately. Not defiance, calculation. She was looking at the device, at his grip, at the particular tension in his trigger hand. She was counting. Now, he said. She moved to the wall. Kodiak's handler was perfectly still, the lead held loose in his hand, watching the dog. Kodiak was watching Callum with every cell it had. The lights in the east wing flickered again. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarm began to sound. Emily stood against the wall in a hospital she'd worked in for 18 months. In a town she'd moved to because it was remote and unremarkable and the kind of place people stopped looking after a while. She looked at the man holding a device connected to a ward full of people who had nothing to do with any of this. She looked at Dario Venn, who was watching her with an expression that had moved past assessment and into something closer to wait. She looked at Kodiak, who had not taken its eyes off the threat for a single second. The monitor alarm down the hall got louder. The lights in the east wing went out entirely. And in the moment before the backup power kicked in and the emergency lighting cast the trauma bay in its flat amber glow, Emily Vasquez did one thing. She counted exits. She counted patients. She counted the exact number of steps between her position and the device in that man's hand. Then she stood still, and she waited because the time for what came next hadn't arrived yet. But it was close. The amber light hummed overhead, and the man who wasn't a doctor watched her from across the room, and somewhere in the dark east wing, the monitors were screaming. The amber light did what emergency lighting always does in a crisis. It made everything look worse than it was and better than it felt. Emily counted 3 seconds after the east wing went dark, long enough for the room to register the shift, for the alarm pitch to settle into the particular sustained frequency that meant sustained failure rather than transient fault, for Callum to recalibrate his positioning relative to the door. He'd moved 2 steps left during the blackout. Small adjustment, told her something. Dolores was at the nursing station, her hand on the landline that hadn't worked reliably since Tuesday. Renata had gone still near the IV pole she'd been adjusting when this started, and her stillness had the quality of someone who was frightened and disciplined enough not to show it as panic. Briggs, the travel nurse, had backed against the far wall and was watching Callum with wide eyes that kept moving to the SEAL team, trying to read the room from people who knew more than she did. Dr. Hall hadn't moved at all. He was standing in the center of the trauma bay with his gloved hands at his sides, and the expression on his face was the one people wear when the architecture of a situation collapses faster than they can process. He was a good doctor. Emily had worked beside him for a year and a half, and she believed that without reservation. He was good at the thing he was trained for, and this was not that thing. Venn had shifted his weight to his stronger leg, and his injured arm was no longer hanging loose. He'd been measuring the room since the lights changed. Kodiak's handler, Emily still didn't have his name, had moved the lead to his left hand. Callum was watching all of it. He was good at watching. She'd give him that. His threat assessment was running continuously, and he was updating it in something close to real time. The device in his hand hadn't moved, and his grip on it hadn't changed, which meant he was maintaining genuine operational discipline under pressure. That was concerning in a specific way. It meant he wasn't a peripheral operative. He was trained. "Back up," he said to Venn. "All the way to the wall behind you." Venn didn't move. "Those are your patients too, if we're calling you a doctor." "I won't ask again." "You haven't asked at all," Venn said. "You've been giving orders since you walked in here." "That's a different thing." Callum's eyes went briefly to Emily, then back to Venn. The brief detour meant something. She was a variable he hadn't fully calculated, and the badge exchange and the road timeline had flagged her as more than background noise. She needed to reduce her profile before he decided reducing it himself was efficient. She shifted her weight, let her shoulders drop slightly, looked at the floor between her feet. Smaller. Less. The woman by the wall who'd said one inconvenient thing and then ran out of usefulness. She heard Callum's attention leave her. The monitor alarm from the east wing had been joined by a second one now. Different pitch, different system, the particular two-tone pattern that signaled ventilator interruption. 3 patients back there. She'd reviewed the census when she came on shift at 5. An elderly woman post-cardiac surgery, a veteran with a traumatic brain injury who'd been admitted 6 days ago, and a 34-year-old with a severe respiratory infection who wasn't stable enough to breathe without the machine. None of them had a timeline that accommodated power failure. Dolores said very carefully, "Those patients will die." "The backup generator covers critical care systems," Callum said. "The East Wing backup has been malfunctioning for 4 days," Emily said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out because it was operationally relevant and her brain didn't always check intent before deploying information. "Maintenance has 3 open tickets on it. It'll cycle once and drop. Whoever manages this building's infrastructure didn't close the loop." Callum looked at her. "You have 20 minutes, she said. "Maybe less." "Then I suggest everyone cooperate quickly," he said. It was the wrong answer, not morally. She already knew his moral position, but tactically. He'd just confirmed that the East Wing power failure wasn't incidental. He'd used it as a lever and he'd leaned on it openly, which meant he'd already accepted the possibility of those outcomes. She filed that in the part of her mind where she kept things that changed the parameters. Ven had caught it too. She saw it in the small adjustment of his jaw. "What do you want?" Dr. Hall said. His voice had steadied. People surprised her sometimes. Hall wasn't tactical, wasn't military, had probably never been in a room with a real threat before tonight, but he'd found something underneath the shock and was using it. "Tell me what you want, and let's figure out if there's a version of this where those people don't die." Callum's attention moved to him. Calculating whether the offer was genuine or stalling. It was stalling. Hall was smart enough for that much. "Information," Callum said. "Specifically, a personnel file, medical records. Things that were buried 5 years ago that I've been commissioned to recover." He paused. "There's one person in this building who knows exactly what I'm talking about." Nobody moved. "I'm not here for the SEAL team," he said. "I'm not here for the patients. I'm not here for any of you. This doesn't have to be a problem for anyone except the one person it concerns." Emily kept her eyes on the floor between her feet. Her breathing was controlled and even, and she was thinking about the supply corridor behind the medication cabinet, the layout of the East Wing relative to the central generator panel, and the fact that Callum's device had a 3-minute delay on release, which meant if he dropped it, there was a window. Not a comfortable window, not a window anyone would choose voluntarily, but a window. "Who?" Paul said. "She knows," Callum said. Long silence. Long enough to be uncomfortable, which was its function. Dolores made a small sound, not accusatory, just startled, and Emily felt the weight of several sets of eyes shift toward her without anyone actually looking directly at her. The way eyes move in a room when a conclusion is being drawn, but nobody wants to be the one to draw it out loud. She lifted her head. "You've been tracking me since the storm coverage changed," she said. Not a question. Callum's posture shifted fractionally. Confirmation. "You weren't here for the SEAL transport. You were already in position when that call came in." She kept her voice level, the tone of someone running through logistics rather than emotions. "The transport was an opportunity to access the building with a cover reason. The blizzard gave you the isolation window." "Smart," Callum said. The word wasn't a compliment. It was a threat assessment being updated in real time. "Not particularly," Emily said. "You left the badge in a place where the dog could reach it. That was a problem." Kodiak's handler looked at his dog. Something passed between them that didn't require words. "So," Callum said, "now that we understand each other, come with me. We handle this somewhere private, and I guarantee every person in this room is still breathing when the storm clears." You guarantee," Emily said. "I'm a professional." "You're holding a device connected to life support systems in a hospital and using 3 critically ill patients as leverage," Emily said. "That's not a professional guarantee. That's coercion with a timer." Hall was looking at her with the expression again, the one that kept recalculating. Renata had the same look. Briggs had stopped watching the SEALs and was watching Emily. "What file?" Ven said. Callum looked at him sharply. "She said a personnel file," Ven said. "Medical records. Things buried 5 years ago. I'm asking what file because if this is what I think it is, then I've got a problem with the conversation we're about to have. This doesn't involve you, Petty Officer." "You said Operation Sandthorn," Ven said. "That's not something a Ridgeback Regional Trauma Consult should know. So I'm involved whether you want me to be or not." Mornaha. The second alarm from the east wing shifted pitch, a sound that meant a system had switched to secondary power rather than primary. The secondary was the one with 4 days of maintenance tickets on it. It would hold or it wouldn't, and there was no way to know from here. And every minute this conversation continued was a minute the answer to that question was arriving. Emily moved. Not fast, not aggressive. She took 3 steps toward the supply corridor door, unhurried, the way she moved when she was restocking, which she'd done often enough that the motion pattern was embedded in how she occupied this room. "Stop," Callum said. "The generator panel is behind the east corridor," she said without stopping. "If the secondary cycles, I can manually isolate the critical care circuit. Takes about 4 minutes. I've done it twice before during maintenance tests." She reached the corridor door. "You can shoot me and lose your leverage, or you can let me keep those patients alive and we continue this conversation when I come back." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Or," she said, "you can come with me and watch me do it, and I can't go anywhere because the only exit from that corridor is back through this room." Silence. 3 seconds. "Move slow," he said. She pushed through the corridor door and walked toward the generator panel at exactly the speed of someone who wasn't afraid. The supply corridor connected the trauma bay to the East Wing's mechanical room through a passage that most staff used for linen carts and equipment transfers. The overhead strip lighting was on the hospital's primary circuit, which was still running. The main generator covered central operations, labs, surgical, and the primary nursing floors. The East Wing was the problem, and it was the problem because of maintenance tickets that had been deprioritized 3 weeks in a row because the hospital administrator kept pushing the repair cost into the next budget cycle. Emily knew the generator panel's layout from the first month she'd worked here. She knew it the way she knew every physical layout in every building she'd spent time in. Not obsessively, not anxiously, but completely. It was a habit built in environments where the location of a door, a panel, a stairwell mattered in ways she'd had to learn not to explain to people. Callum was 4 feet behind her, which was closer than she wanted but farther than she'd expected. He'd made a tactical choice, close enough to control her, far enough to maintain field of vision back toward the trauma bay door. Not bad. She adjusted. The mechanical room was small and loud with the cycling of the backup generator, which was doing exactly what she'd predicted, running irregularly, the output indicator light flickering amber instead of holding steady green. The power routing board was on the right wall, clearly labeled because the hospital had installed it when they upgraded the ICU systems 2 years ago, and the contractor had done good work on the labeling even if the underlying maintenance culture had let the hardware deteriorate. She found the critical care circuit breaker and the manual isolation switch above it. Located the stabilization override, which was a less used function, the one that pushed available power preferentially to life-critical systems by shedding the lower priority draws on the same circuit. "What are you doing?" Callum said. Not a question. Monitoring. "Isolating the ventilator circuit from the other east wing draws," she said. "The secondary generator is struggling because it's powering the whole wing. If I shed the non-critical loads, it stabilizes what's left." She moved the first switch. The rooms will go dark. The hallway lights will go dark. The ventilators stay on. The generator sound changed, a slight reduction in the laboring quality, the indicator light shifting from flickering amber toward a steadier state. "How long have you worked here?" he said. 18 months. "How long before you worked here?" She kept her hands on the panel. "That's the question you came here to answer." "I already know the answer," Callum said. "I have the file, or most of it. The parts that weren't sealed under a classification level that requires a flag officer's authorization to access. I need the parts that were sealed." He paused. "And I need to know where the evidence is." "What evidence?" "Don't," he said. "We're past that." The generator stabilized. Not perfectly. There was still a roughness to its cycle that told her it was running on borrowed time, but the ventilator circuit light on the board went steady green, and the alarm tone from the east wing dropped to a single sustained note and then stopped. The silence after an alarm is a particular kind of quiet, heavy, like a room catching its breath. "The people who commissioned you," Emily said. She was still facing the board. "They told you what they needed from me." "They told me what they needed," he said. "You're the means of getting it. They told you I'd be compliant." A pause. They told me the situation would produce compliance. She turned around. He was 4 feet away, the device still in his hand, his expression doing the particular thing that faces do when someone is both confident and working to stay that way. "You've been in the field," she said, "not your field." "No," she agreed, "but enough to know that compliance under duress is unreliable. Whatever I tell you in this room, you can't verify, and I can retract it before you get 20 miles from this building, so what they actually sent you for isn't information." She watched his face. "They sent you to remove me." Callum didn't answer, which was its own answer. She looked at the device. "Is that connected to anything else? Or was the East Wing the only play?" "Why would I tell you that?" "Because the East Wing patients are stable now, which means your leverage shifted. And the people in the trauma bay are SEAL team personnel, one of whom just demonstrated he has specific knowledge of a classified operation connected to whatever file you're looking for, which means your extraction window just got significantly more complicated than your briefing suggested." Something moved behind his eyes. Not doubt, recalculation. "My extraction window is fine," he said. "The road is closed," she said. "The airport has been non-operational since the weather escalation. Whatever transport you arranged is either stuck at the county line or it's—" She stopped. She stopped because she heard something. Not from inside the hospital. From outside, cutting through the wind noise that had been the constant background since the storm peaked. A sound that didn't belong to a blizzard, and didn't belong to the mechanical room, and didn't belong to anything that should be in the sky over Vantara, Alaska, at 7:30 on a night when nothing was flying. Rotors. Not one aircraft, more than one. The particular overlapping frequency of multiple helicopters in formation, flying low enough to be audible through reinforced walls and storm noise. Callum heard it too. She watched him hear it. His hand tightened on the device. "That's your extraction," Emily said quietly. But his face said something different. His face said that wasn't his extraction at all. Back in the trauma bay, the shift had happened in the 3 minutes Emily and Callum had been gone. Ven had moved to the other side of the bed nearest the door while the room's attention was on the corridor. The SEAL team's 2 walking wounded members had redistributed their positions in the room in a way that wasn't accidental. One near the crash cart, one near the hallway access. The man with the GSW had a hand under the blanket covering his legs in a way that hadn't been there before Emily left. She noticed all of it in the 2 seconds it took her to walk back through the corridor door. Callum noticed most of it. He'd stopped in the doorway. "Nobody moved," Ven said pleasantly. "Everybody moved," Callum said. "We're injured patients. We shift around." The rotors were louder now, close enough that everyone in the room could hear them, close enough that the amber emergency lighting seemed to vibrate slightly against the frequency. Dolores was on the landline. Her back was half turned, but Emily could see her mouth moving and the particular stillness of someone who has reached a live line and is choosing every word with precision. Callum registered Dolores. His jaw set. "Put it down," he said. Dolores turned. She held the phone out to her side and kept her eyes on him with an expression that Emily had seen on nurses who'd worked pediatric oncology and combat support units and every hard place in between. The expression of a person who has decided something and is no longer negotiating with that decision. "I already talked," she said. The sound of the rotors was directly overhead now. Callum looked at the ceiling for 1 second. A human response he couldn't suppress, the instinct to orient toward a sound. In that second, Emily moved 2 steps to the left. Not toward him, lateral, repositioning. When he looked back down, she was in a different place than she'd been, and the geometry of the room had changed around him. "Who did you call?" he said to Dolores. "The number on the emergency contact list," Dolores said. "The one that's labeled critical incident, federal response. I figured this qualified." Callum's hand came up. Not the device hand, his other hand reaching for his coat pocket. "Don't," Ven said. Everybody in the room understood what that word meant coming from that man at that moment. And in the fraction of a second where the situation teetered on its hinge, Kodiak made the decision for all of them. The dog didn't wait for a command. It didn't wait for a signal. Its handler had let the lead go slack. Deliberately, Emily understood only later, because the man had been positioning for exactly this. and Kodiak crossed the 12 feet between its position and Callum in under 2 seconds, 60 miles an hour of focused animal intention, and it took the arm, the right arm, the device hand. Callum went down hard, and the device skittered across the tile. Emily was already moving before it stopped sliding. She covered the distance in 4 steps, dropped to one knee, picked it up, confirmed the indicator light was still red, active, armed, and held the trigger steady. The way she held it said she'd held things like this before. Not this specific device, but things with a trigger and a consequence and a 3-minute window on the back end of a mistake. Callum was on the floor with Kodiak on his arm and Ven standing over him, and whatever he'd been reaching for in his coat pocket was now in Ven's hand. The room was very still. Then the south ambulance doors blew open. Not the automatic slide, the emergency manual release, the lever that bypassed the electronic lock, and cold air and snow came in ahead of 4 people in tactical gear, weapons up, moving in the practiced spread of people who had trained for exactly this entry, calling clear into corners, reading the room in segments. A 5th person came in behind them. Civilian cold weather gear, no weapon visible, a federal credentials wallet already open in one hand. The woman was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact gray starting at her temples, the particular economy of movement of someone who has been in too many rooms like this to waste energy on anything unnecessary. She looked at the room. She looked at Callum on the floor. She looked at the device in Emily's hand. Then she looked at Emily for a moment that lasted approximately 1 second and contained a great deal more information than that. "Vasquez," she said. "Ma'am," Emily said. It was the wrong thing to say, or the right thing. She never fully decided. She hadn't used that word in 18 months, had carefully and consistently replaced it with the civilian vocabulary of a nurse at a regional hospital in a town that didn't ask questions. And it came out in front of Hall and Renata and Dolores and the entire assembled room without her permission. Dolores was staring at her. Hall's expression had stopped recalculating and arrived somewhere new entirely. The woman with the federal credentials looked at the device. "Is it live?" "Yes," Emily said. "East Wing Critical Care Circuit. I've isolated the ventilators, but the override is manual. If the trigger releases, we've got 3 minutes before it reroutes." "Can you disarm it?" Emily looked at the device. She turned it over once, read the casing. Not military standard, custom manufacture, but based on a configuration she'd seen used by a specific subset of contractors operating in a specific theater, using components sourced through a supply chain that connected to 3 countries and 2 shell companies. "Give me 4 minutes," she said. The federal agent looked at her for another one of those loaded seconds. Then she looked at Callum. "Get him up," she said to the tactical team. The ambulance bay was full of cold air and rotor noise, and the mess of a situation that had broken open in ways that couldn't be closed again. Dolores was still holding the phone. Renata had sat down on the edge of the supply cart and was looking at her hands. Briggs hadn't moved from the wall. Dr. Hall walked toward Emily. He stopped 3 feet away. "Vasquez," he said. "I know," she said. She was still looking at the device, working through its architecture. "I need you to tell me." "Later," she said. Not dismissive. Urgent. She'd found the secondary trigger housing, and the isolation path wasn't where she'd expected it to be, which meant this was a later generation build than what she'd trained on, which meant the next 3 minutes required everything she had. "I need to concentrate." He stopped. He looked at the side of her face for a moment, and whatever he saw there made him step back and give her the space she needed. The device had 4 components. She identified 3 of them inside 90 seconds. The 4th was the problem. A redundancy circuit she'd have to bypass without triggering the primary release, using nothing but her hands and the tools in her coat pockets, which were a pen light, 2 safety pins she kept for badge clips, and a set of trauma shears. The trauma shears. Obviously. She started working. Behind her, Ven said something quiet to Kodiak's handler that she didn't catch. One of the tactical team members had Callum in a transport hold against the far wall. The federal agent was on her own radio, coordinating something outside. The East Wing generator cycled again. A rough, laboring sound that said it was losing its battle with the load, isolation or not. Emily's hands were steady. They were always steady. She'd been told once, by a man in a forward operating base during a different kind of emergency, that her hands were unnaturally steady under pressure. She'd told him it wasn't unnatural, it was practice. He'd asked what you practiced to get hands like that. She'd told him, everything you were afraid of until you weren't. The redundancy circuit required her to hold tension on 2 points simultaneously, which required both hands, which meant she had to set the device on the floor and work over it on her knees, and for approximately 45 seconds, there was nothing in the room she could pay attention to except the mechanism in front of her. She didn't like those 45 seconds, but she stayed in them. The primary indicator light went from red to amber. She exhaled, found the final isolation point, pressed, green. She sat back on her heels. The room let out a collective breath, but not audible, but she felt it. The change in pressure that happens when a group of people stop bracing for something. She picked up the disarm device, stood, and handed it to the federal agent. The East Wing generator is going to fail within the hour regardless, she said. You need to get the maintenance team in there or transfer the critical care patients before it drops. The agent took the device without breaking eye contact. Noted. A pause. Are you all right? Emily looked at her hands, steady, no different than they'd ever been. I'm fine, she said, which was true, and also the kind of answer that didn't cover the whole territory of the question. She knew the agent knew that. She also knew this wasn't the time or place for the rest of it. She turned toward the trauma bay proper, toward Dolores and Hall and Renata and the SEAL team and the whole complicated wreckage of the last 45 minutes, and found every person in the room looking at her. Not the way they'd been looking at her at 5 p.m., when she was the quiet nurse on observation, the one who refilled IVs, the one Renata was territorial with because she didn't see her as a threat to territory. Different. The way people look at someone when the category they've filed them in turns out to be completely wrong. Dolores said slowly, Emily. Yeah, Emily said. Who are you? It was the most honest version of the question anyone could have asked, and it deserved an honest answer, and Emily opened her mouth to give whatever version of that answer this situation called for. Then the agent's radio crackled. Ma'am? A male voice, tactical frequency. We've got a problem on the perimeter. One of our vehicles is reporting a secondary contact, armed, moving toward the east entrance. The agent looked up sharply. How many? One confirmed, possibly two. They were already inside the property before we established the perimeter. Emily closed her mouth. The federal agent looked at her. The look of someone recalculating a situation that had just added a dimension nobody had accounted for. Callum wasn't working alone, Emily said. Not a question. The agent said nothing for 1 second. How many exits does this building have, she said, and her voice had changed from the careful, measured tone of a federal officer managing a resolved situation to something flatter and more immediate, and everyone in the room understood simultaneously that the situation was not resolved. Emily looked at the east entrance corridor, 20 feet of hallway, one door with a mechanical lock that had been unreliable since autumn. No camera coverage since the system had been knocked out by the power fluctuations. She looked at Ven. He was already watching the corridor. Kodiak had turned to face the east entrance before any of them, ears forward, every sensor it possessed oriented toward the door. The dog hadn't been wrong yet. The east entrance door had a 9-second delay on its manual lock, a quirk Emily knew because she'd used that entrance for 18 months of early shifts, and the delay was long enough to be annoying and short enough that maintenance had never prioritized fixing it. 9 seconds. She said it out loud, not loudly, just factually. East entrance has a 9-second manual delay. Mechanical override is on the inside panel, left of the frame. Anyone coming through that door has to know it's there, or they're standing in the gap, waiting. The federal agent, her name was Solis, Emily had caught it on the credentials wallet, was already moving her tactical team toward the corridor. 2 of the 4 peeled off toward the east wing access, weapons drawn, moving in the compressed efficient stride of people who had done building clearance enough times for it to be physical memory rather than conscious action. Ven had moved to the GSW patient's bed and was doing something under the blanket that Emily understood and chose not to comment on. Staff, sus, Solis said, sharp and direct. Everyone not medical. Corridor now. Nurses, stay with your patients. Briggs went. 2 of the hospital's auxiliary staff who'd been frozen near the supply room went with her. Dr. Hall didn't move. Hall, Emily said. I'm staying, he said. Then stay out of the sight lines from that doorway. She pointed to the alcove behind the crash cart. There. You can see both patients, and you're not an angle problem. He looked at her for a half second, then moved to the alcove. She'd stopped being surprised by the moment when people shifted their deference, when the category collapsed, and whatever was under it took over. It happened the same way every time. A threshold and then a different kind of listening. Renata was already beside the ventilated seal, checking his chest tube output, her hands moving on autopilot while her eyes tracked the east corridor door. She was frightened. Emily could see it in the set of her jaw, but she wasn't leaving her patient. Emily had been wrong about Renata in small ways, and she acknowledged it silently and moved on. Dolores was behind the nursing station counter, which was solid hardwood construction from a 1990s renovation, and she had the landline in her hand again and was talking quietly and continuously into it. Good. Keep the line open. Keep the information flowing outward to whatever coordination point Solis's team was using. Kodiak had gone to a low alert stance, body dropped, weight forward, eyes fixed on the east corridor. Not the frantic energy of an animal reacting to noise. The focused, still attention of a working animal that has identified a specific target and is waiting for permission or necessity. His handler, the man with the dark circles whose name Emily finally heard when Solis addressed him, Warrant Officer Gage Tully, had repositioned to a point where he could release the lead in either direction, depending on what came through the door. 12 seconds of near silence. The blizzard outside filled the gap with wind noise and the intermittent protest of the East Wing generator, which was running rough but running. Then the East Corridor door opened. It opened wrong, not the full swing of someone entering with confidence, but a partial push, the kind of entry that keeps the body behind the frame while the sight line clears. Someone who had done this before. The tactical team in the corridor called challenge, clear, sharp, by the book, and the door closed again. Then something came through the East Corridor ceiling, not a person. A device, small, cylindrical, trailing a thin wire, dropped through a ventilation access panel that someone had already partially unsecured, probably during the window when the trauma bay had been focused entirely on Callum and the East Wing power failure. It hit the floor near the secondary nursing station and discharged a white chemical fog that expanded fast and low, knee-height immediately, waist height within 4 seconds. CS gas. Not military grade. The particle density was wrong for the standard formulation. Too thin, the eye irritation immediate but not incapacitating. Modified. Enough to drive people out of a space but not enough to put them down. People were moving before the identification was complete. Staff toward the corridor, away from the cloud, the instinctive retreat from a chemical threat. Hall put his coat over his face. Renata was already pushing the ventilated patient's bed toward the hallway door, one hand on the portable vent that had been standing by for exactly this kind of patient transport. Vasquez! Solis's voice from somewhere in the fog. East exit. The patients. My team has the patients. You need to move. Emily understood what that meant. She was the asset. She was what the secondary contact was here for, same as Callum, and keeping her in a room with compromised air and limited sight lines was a worse problem than moving her. She moved toward the south ambulance bay, opposite direction from the east entrance, pulling her collar up over her mouth, staying low where the fog was thinnest. The chemical bite was already in her eyes, the specific sting that made the world swim at the edges, manageable but not ignorable. Tully was behind her with Kodiak. The dog wasn't bothered by the fog. The olfactory function that made it useful in any environment meant it was operating on inputs the gas didn't touch. The south ambulance bay was cold and clear and full of the sound of the blizzard hitting the metal doors. 2 of Solis's tactical team were already there, the ones who hadn't gone to the east corridor, and one of them pointed Emily toward a position behind the parked ambulance that gave cover from 3 angles. She crouched behind the wheel well. Tully and Kodiak were beside her. Tully's hand was on the dog's collar rather than the lead, the light hold of someone who might need to release fast. How many did your team confirm? Emily said. 2 outside. 1 came in through the vent access. Tully's voice was level. The one outside is still out there. The perimeter? Blizzard conditions limit coverage, he said. 20 feet of visibility max, they knew that. They'd known it because someone had planned this with knowledge of the storm timeline, the hospital layout, the perimeter limitations of an emergency response in Arctic weather. This wasn't improvisation. The Callum entry was the primary and the secondary contact was the contingency. If Callum was neutralized, the secondary came in differently, used the chaos of a federal response as cover, moved while everyone was oriented toward the resolved threat. It was a good plan. It had almost worked twice. Inside, she could hear movement, controlled, the tactical team clearing the gas-affected space. Someone was coughing. A monitor alarm had started again, different wing, probably triggered by the patient transport disruption. Then a sound she placed before she consciously identified it. The South Ambulance bay door, the personnel access panel on the right side, the one that required a staff badge or a manual code. The light on the panel went green. The code. Someone had the code. The door opened outward and cold air hit the bay in a solid wall, and the person who came through it was moving fast and low and was already inside the vehicle's sightline before the tactical team members had fully reoriented. Emily came up from behind the wheel well. The man was large, not tallest, but built wide, the kind of physical mass that meant his movement options were powerful rather than agile. He had his weapon up and he was scanning, and in the 3/4 second before he landed on her position, she saw his face and identified two things. He was trained, and he was surprised she was standing rather than running. That half second of surprise was what she had. She didn't have a weapon. She had her position behind the ambulance, a tire iron mounted to the vehicle's side panel, that she'd noticed the first week she worked here because she noticed things like that. And approximately 6 years of training in environments where weapons were not always available, and survival was not optional. She grabbed the tire iron, closed the distance in 4 steps, and changed the geometry. She didn't go for the weapon hand. That was the obvious play, and obvious plays got people killed. She went for his base, his footing, the mechanics of how a large body maintains its stability on a concrete floor with snow tracked in from outside. He adjusted because he was trained, and his elbow came back hard and caught her left shoulder with enough force to stagger her. She used the stagger. Went with it, dropped under his field, came back up on his left side. He was turning when Kodiak hit him. The dog came off the floor like a release spring, 60 miles an hour of focused mass taking him at the chest, and the combination of the dog's impact and the slick floor and Emily's disruption of his footing took him down in a way that wasn't recoverable. His weapon discharged once into the ceiling, the crack of it enormous in the enclosed bay, ringing in Emily's ears like a physical thing. And then Tully was there, and the weapon was gone, and it was over. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Emily's shoulder was going to be purple by morning. She rotated it experimentally, full range, nothing structural, bruised, and going to stay bruised for 2 weeks. Tully looked at her over the man on the floor. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. It came out slightly breathless, which she allowed because that was honest. "Your dog saved my shoulder." Tully looked at Kodiak, who had released and stepped back and was watching the downed man with the alert patience of an animal that has completed its task and is prepared to repeat it if necessary. "He's motivated," Tully said. The tactical team had the man secured in under a minute. He was conscious and going to stay that way. The fall had been hard, but not catastrophic. He was also not talking, which was expected, and the particular quality of his silence had the shape of someone with training that included resistance to interrogation. Emily looked at his hands, at the specific calluses on his right palm, at the faded mark on his left wrist that was either a scar or a remnant of a specific type of wrist restraint used in a specific context. She'd seen that mark before, on someone else's wrist, in a different country and a different time. "Solis needs to check his left forearm," she said to the tactical team member securing him. "Under the sleeve. There's probably a contact identification marker, the kind used by a specific contractor network that operates in the Northern Pacific Theater." The team member looked at her, looked at Tully. Tully nodded. They rolled up the man's sleeve. The mark was there. Small, discreet, the kind of thing that looked like an old medical tattoo or a blood type notation, and was neither. Emily knew what it was because she'd spent 8 months tracking the network that used it, and she knew what it connected to, and she felt the thing in her chest that was not quite satisfaction. and not quite dread. The feeling of a shape you've been moving toward for years finally becoming fully visible. She said nothing immediately, just looked at it. Then, his extraction point. It's not the road. Solis had appeared in the ambulance bay doorway. Her coat was open and she had the disarm device from earlier in her left hand and her radio in her right, and the expression of someone who had been managing cascading problems for the last hour and had not yet found the bottom of the stack. Say that again, Solis said. The road's been closed since 4. They came in with knowledge of the storm timeline, which means they knew the road would be closed. Their extraction isn't vehicle-based. Emily looked at the ceiling, calculating. There's a service road on the east side of the property. Not on the public maps, it's a maintenance access. It runs behind the generator building to a flat clearing that's been used for helicopter landings during summer medical transfers. Solis said, in a blizzard? With the right aircraft and the right pilot, it's feasible. Narrow window, but feasible. Emily looked at the man on the floor. Someone is waiting for him, and for Callum. Solis was already on the radio, but Emily was looking at the far wall of the ambulance bay, at the industrial shelving along the east side, at the specific configuration of the stored equipment, and something was wrong with it. Something was different from this morning. Third shelf from the bottom. An orange equipment case that hadn't been there at the start of her shift, pushed behind a stack of folded trauma tarps that would have made it invisible to anyone not running through the inventory the way she did, in her head, automatically, every time she entered a room. Solis, she said. Her voice was different enough that Solis stopped mid-transmission. Emily walked to the shelf and pulled the case out and set it on the floor and looked at the latch configuration and the pressure indicator on the side panel and felt something cold that was not from the blizzard. She'd seen cases configured this way exactly once before. In a classified brief, in a context that had nothing to do with civilian medicine and nothing to do with Iron Ridge Medical Center and everything to do with the network whose mark was on the man's wrist on the floor behind her. Everyone out of this bay, she said. Flat, immediate, no room for interpretation. What is that? Solis said. Out now. Take everyone at least 200 feet from this building's east side. Vasquez, I need 30 seconds and then I need the bay clear. She looked up. Tully, Kodiak out. The dog out first. Tully moved without asking why. That was the quality of a man who had learned to trust a specific tone of voice in a specific kind of moment. Solis looked at Emily for exactly 1 second with an expression that was asking the question that couldn't be asked in the time available. Emily held her gaze. I know what this is. I've seen the configuration. Give me the 30 seconds. Solis made the call, started moving people. Emily turned back to the case. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She opened the latch configuration and looked at what was inside and confirmed what she'd hoped was wrong. It was a remote-triggered incendiary system. Not explosive in the conventional sense, but designed to generate a sustained thermal event in a concentrated area, the kind of thing that looks like an electrical fire after the fact, and takes forensics 3 weeks to identify correctly. Planted here to eliminate the building's ambulance access, cut off the response vehicles, and create a secondary crisis that would pull Solis's team from their perimeter coverage while Callum's backup extracted through the service road. The trigger was external. Someone outside the building still had it. She had to find the receiver and isolate it before whoever was outside made the decision that the operation was compromised and initiated the contingency. She started working. Her hands were steady. The components were different from the East Wing device, different manufacture, different tier of sophistication, the kind of gap that suggested these two pieces of equipment came from different sources within the same network, the right hand not fully knowing what the left hand was doing. That was information. The receiver was behind the heating element on the right side of the case. She could see the wire run. She needed to interrupt the circuit before the signal reached it, which meant finding the junction point, which was buried under a secondary panel that required, she checked, a standard flathead to open. She didn't have a flathead. She had trauma shears, a pen light, and 2 safety pins. The safety pin would work. Barely. Uncomfortably. With a margin for error that she didn't love. She straightened the pin and began. Outside, the blizzard hit the building in a sustained gust that rattled the ambulance bay doors. and in the sudden noise of it, Emily heard something underneath. The specific frequency of a helicopter at distance, not Solis's birds. Those had landed, but something smaller, something lower, coming from the northeast. The extraction aircraft. Coming in regardless. Which meant the person with the trigger had just received a signal that the window was closing. Her hands moved faster. The pin slipped once on the panel edge. She made a sound that was not quite a word, repositioned, tried the angle from above instead of straight on. The panel released. She found the junction. The wire was the wrong color from what the configuration diagram in her memory suggested it should be, which either meant her memory was wrong or this was a modified build. Either way, the interrupt point was the interrupt point regardless of the wire color. She isolated the lead, pressed the pin across both terminals. The indicator light on the case went from active green to dead. She sat back on her heels, exactly as she'd done with the first device, and exhaled once, and for 3 seconds she allowed herself to feel the specific weight of the last 90 minutes. Then she stood, picked up the case, and carried it to the exterior door, away from the building, away from the patients, away from the people Solis had cleared from the bay, and set it in the snow. Then she went back inside. The ambulance bay was empty except for Solis, who had not gone 200 feet and had not sent anyone in after Emily, but had also not left the doorway. "Clear," Emily said. Solis looked at her, at the door, at the empty bay. "The extraction aircraft is northeast, coming in low," Emily said. "If your pilots can establish intercept, you've got maybe 4 minutes before it's in the service road clearing." Solis got on the radio. Her voice was controlled and her instructions were precise, and she was good at this. Emily could see it, had been seeing it all night. But there was a current under the professional surface that was reading Emily in a way that had shifted since the first moment in the trauma bay. And Emily knew what was coming and could not defer it much longer. Tully appeared in the exterior door, Kodiak beside him, snow on the dog's vest, having circled the building rather than leaving. "Aircraft is inbound," Tully said. "Military intercept is on it." "Good," Solis said. She clicked off the radio. She looked at Emily. "We've been looking for you." Emily said nothing. "Not the way he was looking for you," Solis said, nodding toward the direction where Callum was presumably in tactical custody. "Different reason." She paused. "Different department." The East Wing generator made a sound like a truck going over a cattle grid, one loud, irregular lurch, and then the lights in the East Corridor went out entirely and did not come back. Emily looked at the dark corridor. "The patients," she said. "My team has them on manual. The TBI patient in room 4 has an ICP monitor that runs on a separate circuit from the vent. If it's down, we've got a narrow window before the pressure reading is compromised, and we can't manage his intracranial pressure without imaging." She was already moving toward the East Corridor. "I need to get in there." "Vasquez," Solis's voice behind her. "We're not done." "No," Emily agreed without stopping. "We're not." She went into the dark corridor, navigating by the penlight in her pocket, moving toward the room where a man with a traumatic brain injury had nothing between him and a serious complication except the next 60 seconds of intervention. She made it to room 4 in 38. The ICP monitor was dark. The patient, his name was written on the whiteboard above his bed in Dolores's handwriting, Warren Kells, veteran, 6 days post-injury, was breathing on his own, which was one mercy, his vent having been switched to the manual bag by whoever Solis's team had put in here. But the intracranial pressure had been trending at the high end of acceptable all week, and without the monitor she was working blind. She did what she could do without imaging and without the monitor, positioned his head, checked the manual pressure assessments she could perform at bedside, identified the clinical signs that would tell her before the equipment would whether the situation was deteriorating. His pupils were equal and reactive. She breathed. Behind her, the door opened. Penlight in the doorway. Not hers. Renata. "I've got the portable monitor," Renata said, slightly breathless, carrying a unit Emily recognized from the supply room. "Battery. It'll run for 40 minutes. Emily moved aside to give her the access angle. They worked together in the dark room with the blizzard outside and the battery monitor coming online, and the sound of the helicopter somewhere to the northeast getting louder, and then, sharply, being answered by something larger and faster. Military intercept. Then the sound of the helicopter that wasn't Solis's changed. Pitch, altitude, the particular frequency shift of an aircraft changing its trajectory under pressure from something it didn't want to argue with. Then it was going away. The portable monitor found Warren Kell's pressure reading and held it steady. High normal, not critical, not deteriorating. Emily stood in the dark room and listened to the aircraft sound diminishing, and to the blizzard that wasn't going anywhere, and to the portable monitor's quiet, steady pulse. Renata said, "The man with Kodiak, Tully. He told me your name." Emily looked at her. "Your real name," Renata said. "Or, I don't know. He said the name on your file, not the one we use." A pause. He said there was more to it than that." Emily said nothing for a moment. "There is," she said finally. "Are you going to tell me?" Before Emily could answer, the corridor light flickered. Not full power. Emergency backup from a different circuit, partial, enough to make the hallway visible in the dim orange-gray of minimal wattage. And in that thin, insufficient light, standing in the doorway of Warren Kell's room, was a man Emily had not seen come in from the ambulance bay. Not Tully, not Solis, not any member of the tactical team she'd tracked all evening. He was large, calm, in cold-weather civilian gear with no visible credentials and no visible weapon. And he looked at Emily with the specific expression of a person who has been looking for someone for a very long time and has just found them. And his first words were not a threat. They were, "We need to talk about what happened 5 years ago. Because the people who buried your file, they're not all in custody." The monitor beeped. Renata had gone very still. Emily looked at the man in the doorway and felt the particular quality of a situation reaching its hinge point, the moment before everything either breaks open or closes down, and understood that whatever came next was going to determine not just tonight, but everything after it. "Who sent you?" she said. He reached into his coat. His hand came out of the coat holding a credentials wallet. Not a weapon. A federal identification card in a leather holder, the kind that folds once and opens to show a photograph and an agency seal and a name printed in the particular font that government ID printers use, which is slightly different from every commercial font in a way that's hard to articulate but immediately recognizable. Emily read it in 2 seconds. Defense Intelligence Agency. The name on the card was Reyes, Marcus T. The photograph matched the face in the doorway closely enough to be real, and not so perfectly that it looked manufactured. There was a small scar above the right eyebrow in person that the photo had caught at a bad angle and mostly missed. She'd learned to read credentials fast, and she'd learned to look for the things cameras miss. "Solis know you're here?" she said. "Solis is running an FBI operation," Reyes said. "This is a different lane. 2 federal agencies in 1 hospital on 1 night. You're a popular person," he said. Not lightly, factually. Renata had not moved from her position beside the portable monitor. She was watching this exchange with the focused stillness of someone who understood that what was happening in this room was above her clearance and below her ability to walk away from. "Warren Kell's," Emily said. Not asking, reminding herself. The patient in the bed between her and the man in the doorway. She looked at the monitor reading, pressure holding, pupils equal when she'd last checked 40 seconds ago. The immediate clinical crisis was managed, which meant she had a window, which meant she had no legitimate reason to delay this conversation. She stepped around the bed toward the doorway. "Not here," she said, and she didn't mean in this room. She meant in front of Renata, in front of a patient who was conscious enough to process voices even if he couldn't respond, in the dark corridor of a hospital that was still running on partial power with 3 patients in compromised conditions and a federal response team that hadn't fully secured the property. Reyes moved aside to let her pass. She looked back at Renata. "His pressure starts trending above 22. You find me immediately." "Okay," Renata said. A pause. Emily stopped. "Whatever it is," Renata said, and didn't finish the sentence, and didn't need to. Emily held her gaze for a moment. Then she went into the corridor. The East Wing hallway was dim and cold, with the particular cold of a space that's lost its heating circuit. Not dangerous yet, not in the next hour, but persistent and getting worse. The emergency lighting cast everything in amber and shadow, which meant people's faces were half-readable at best. Emily positioned herself so the light hit Reyes more than it hit her. Old habit. "The people who buried your file," Reyes said, continuing from where he'd been when she cut him off. "You know who they are." "I know some of them," she said. "What if I told you that 2 of them hold current federal appointments?" Emily looked at him. "I'd say that's been true since the year after the operation, and it didn't change anything then. It's different now. Callum's capture tonight, and more importantly, who commissioned him, creates a paper trail that didn't exist before. The network has been operating under the assumption that your information died with your cover. Tonight changed that assumption." He paused. "Which makes this the first time in 5 years there's been a genuine window." She understood what he was saying. She'd understood it since Callum had said the people who commissioned me and declined to elaborate. She'd been running the thread since then, following it backward to its source the way she always ran threads, methodically, without the luxury of hope coloring the analysis. "What do you need from me?" she said. "A formal statement. On record, under DIA protection. What you witnessed during Operation Sandthorn, what you recovered, and where the secondary evidence cache is located." The last part landed in the hallway and stayed there. Emily kept her face exactly where it was. "Who told you there was a secondary cache?" "The same person who told us where you were," Reyes said. "Which is why I need you to understand that this conversation has a limited shelf life. The people who sent Callum don't know the operation failed yet. That window is closing, and when it closes, the chance to move on the federal appointments closes with it." From the south end of the building, she could hear Solis's team moving through clearing procedures. The systematic, unhurried sounds of a response winding down and a scene being secured. Callum would be in transport custody within the hour. The 2 secondary contacts were already down. The aircraft had been turned by military intercept and was gone. What Solis's operation had managed tonight was real and significant, and also, Emily understood, the visible surface of something much larger and older. "You said 2 federal appointments," she said, "Deputy Director of the National Infrastructure Security Board and a Senior Appointments Officer within the Military Contracting Oversight Division." He let that settle. "Both of them were on the authorization chain for the operation that you exposed. Both of them survived the fallout because your evidence file was sealed before it reached the investigative stage." Emily looked at the floor for a moment. Not thinking, she'd already thought this through 100 times in quieter years, but letting the shape of it be visible in the open rather than just inside her own head. "If I give you a formal statement," she said, "my location is on record. My cover is finished regardless of outcome." "Your cover is already finished," Reyes said. "Tonight finished it. Solis's operation has your name and your face and your real service record on federal documentation as of 2 hours ago." There it was, the thing that had been arriving since Kodiak tore the badge off a fake doctor's coat and sent it skidding across the floor. 18 months of careful distance from everything she'd been before. A quiet hospital in a remote town. A set of routines that had almost started feeling like a life rather than a position. All of it was done, and it had been done the moment Dolores called the critical incident line, and there was no version of tonight that ended with Emily Vasquez walking back into obscurity. She'd known it before she picked up the badge. Some part of her had known it the moment Kodiak moved and the room changed. She'd run the decision in real time and made it anyway, which meant she'd already chosen this, even without naming it. "Where's the statement taken?" she said. "Secure facility. We have one established 40 miles north. It's been operational for 6 weeks. It's connected to this investigation. You're already listed as a potential witness." He paused, "which tells you we've been building this for a while." "Tonight wasn't random," she said. "No," Reyes said. "We've known the network was going to move on you. We didn't know when or in what configuration. We were tracking 3 potential access points, and this was number 2. He had the decency to hold her gaze when he said it. "We couldn't warn you without burning our own coverage. I'm sorry for that." She evaluated the apology. It was real, she thought. Not performed, not bureaucratic. He'd been in the field long enough to know what it cost to be the person who couldn't give the warning. The secondary cache, she said. What do you actually know about it? Location, not contents. Who told you the location? Someone who was also at Sandthorn, Reyes said. Someone who's been waiting for the same window you've been waiting for. Emily went still. There were 6 people who'd been at Sandthorn who knew about the secondary cache. 2 of them were dead. One was the person whose compromised position had made the original file's sealing necessary. One was Reyes's source, apparently. That left one possibility she hadn't accounted for, and it sat in her chest with the specific weight of something she'd filed as resolved years ago and apparently hadn't been. She was about to ask when Solis appeared at the south end of the corridor. The FBI agent walked toward them, with her eyes moving between Emily and Reyes in the particular way of someone who has just calculated an overlap she wasn't told about and is deciding how to manage it. Reyes, Solis said, not warmly. Solis, he said, same temperature. You want to tell me what you're doing in my scene? Your scene handled the field operation, Reyes said. I'm handling the upstream consequence. The upstream consequence is being coordinated through the upstream consequence, Reyes said, involves 2 individuals currently holding federal appointments who would be notified through your coordination channel before the first warrant was drafted. So no, it's not going through that channel. Solis looked at him for a long moment, then at Emily. Is he right? She said. About the appointments, Emily said. Yes. About the channel risk? I don't know your structure well enough to confirm or deny, but I know the 2 names he's referring to, and if either of them has any visibility into your reporting chain, then yes. Solis's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, and it meant a great deal. The particular frustration of a good agent realizing that the operation she'd run successfully tonight was the bottom layer of something she hadn't been read into. Names, she said. Reyes looked at Emily. Emily said them. Both of them. Full names, titles, the specific division each of them controlled. She said them in the flat, even tone of someone reading from a document they've had memorized for 5 years, and she watched Solis's face process the information and saw the moment it landed. Because Solis knew one of those names. Emily saw it. The specific kind of recognition that goes deeper than hearing a title. The recognition of someone you've reported to or worked alongside or trusted in the context of your own work. Solis was quiet for 4 seconds. Give me the room, she said to Reyes. He looked at Emily. Emily nodded once. He moved down the corridor. Solis waited until he was out of earshot, which took longer in a dark corridor than in a well-lit one because sound travels differently. How long have you known? Solis said. Since Sandthorn, Emily said. How long have you known the name I just said? I didn't know, Solis said. Not this. I've worked adjacent to that office for 3 years. I've had 4 direct briefings. She stopped. If what you're saying is accurate, it's documented, Emily said. That's what the secondary cache is. It's the documentation, communications, financial routing, authorization signatures, the kind of evidence that doesn't require my testimony to hold up. I'm corroborating material, not the foundation. Solis looked at the ceiling briefly, the look of someone recalculating the weight of what they're holding. Tonight's operation, she said. Our intelligence on the hospital access came through. She stopped herself, deciding how much to say. It came through a source I now need to reevaluate. If the source fed you accurate information about the access attempt, Emily said, they may be running both sides, letting the network move while giving you enough to run a response that looked complete but didn't touch the layer above Callum. Controlled opposition, Solis said. It's not a new tactic. Solis looked at her with the specific expression of an experienced federal agent who has just had the shape of a bad situation clarified by someone she'd been prepared to consider a protected witness rather than a peer. She recalibrated visibly. It wasn't graceful, the shift showed, but she did it. The statement Reyes wants, she said. If it's taken at a DIA facility, it sits in a DIA chain, which has its own exposure points. I know, Emily said. Is there a version where it goes somewhere that neither chain touches? Emily thought about that. Maybe. It depends on who's still clean. She paused. Ven, the petty officer from the SEAL team, He called out Sandthorn by name. That means he's connected to an operational unit with its own intelligence chain that doesn't run through either of the structures we're talking about. Solis looked toward the trauma bay. He's a witness to tonight. He's more than that, Emily said. He was there. Another silence, the kind where decisions happen. I need to make a call, Solis said. A specific call to a specific person, using the emergency contact protocol that bypasses the standard reporting chain. It takes 20 minutes to establish. She met Emily's eyes. Can you keep Reyes occupied for 20 minutes? Emily almost smiled. Almost. That depends on what you mean by occupied. Talk to him. Give him enough to feel like progress is being made. Don't commit to anything. A pause. Can you do that? I've done harder things tonight, Emily said. Solis moved. The 20 minutes were 35. Emily spent them with Reyes in the hospital's small family waiting room. 3 chairs, a wall-mounted television that was dark because the circuit it ran on was one of the sheds Emily had made in the generator panel, and a window that looked out on the ambulance bay where snow was still coming down hard enough to make the parked vehicles into white shapes rather than identifiable objects. She gave him enough, confirmed the general nature of the secondary cache, confirmed the operational window he'd described. Did not give him the cache location, which he'd stopped pressing for after the first 20 minutes, and had replaced with a running conversation about Sandthorn that was partly intelligence gathering and partly, she realized, genuine. The way people in certain professions get when they've been carrying knowledge of something that mattered for a long time and finally have someone in the room who was actually there. The cell that got rolled up afterward, Reyes said, 43 arrests. You know how many came back? Some of them, she said. 21, he said. Different names, different documentation, different countries of origin on paper, same network. They built back faster than we dismantled them because the dismantling was deliberate incomplete. He looked at the dark window. Because the 2 people upstairs needed the network functional. It's how they launder the authorization trails. They move money through the contractor structure moves operations through the network. The network keeps the 2 of them insulated from anything traceable. And Sandthorn was the operation that got too close, Emily said. You got too close, Reyes said. You and the team you were attached to. The team was reassigned within 6 weeks, Emily said, scattered to 4 different theaters. The reassignments came from the appointments division. She looked at him. I noticed I just had no mechanism to do anything with what I noticed. Until now, Reyes said. When Solis came back, her expression had changed. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for dramatic. But the specific set of her shoulders was different. The quality of her attention in the room shifted from managed urgency to something more deliberate. She looked at Emily first. There's a judge, she said. Federal, 9th Circuit, fully independent of both chains. She's been briefed on the case structure through a sealed proceeding that neither of our agencies initiated. She's been waiting for the evidentiary foundation. A pause. She issued 2 sealed warrants 40 minutes ago. Emily was quiet. Based on, Reyes said carefully, what exactly? Based on testimony from a source who provided a sworn deposition 8 days ago, Solis said, at a secure facility I wasn't aware of until an hour ago. She looked at Emily. I told you there was someone else at Sandthorn who knew about the cache. Emily felt the thing in her chest again. The shape she'd filed as resolved years ago. Who? She said, though some part of her had already arrived. Former Navy corpsman, Solis said, attached to a special operations medical support role. He was medically separated 14 months after Sandthorn. He's been, not hiding exactly. He's been positioned, waiting for the same window. A pause. His name is Tobias Wren. Emily sat with that for a moment. Toby Wren, who she'd last seen at a field debrief in a windowless room in a location she couldn't name in any statement because the location itself was classified. Who had looked at her across that table with the specific expression of someone who understood exactly what was being buried and couldn't stop it, and was filing the injustice somewhere it would keep. 14 months later, medically separated. She'd assumed the worst. She'd been wrong. He's alive, she said. He's been working with a military legal oversight team that operates outside the standard JAG structure. Solis said. Connected to the Inspector General chain but with specific investigative independence. They've been building the case. She paused. His deposition named the 2 appointments and provided supporting documentation for 4 of the 8 counts in the sealed warrants. The other 4 counts are based on financial forensics. Her eyes held Emily's. Your testimony and the cash provide the remaining evidentiary support, which means the warrants can be executed the moment you're on record. Reyes said quietly, How long has this been running? Longer than your operation, Solis said. Not triumphant, tired, the way people sound when a long thing is finally at its hinge. Emily looked at the dark window. The snow was still coming down. The warrants name both individuals, she said. Not a question. Both, Solis said. By name, title, and specific count. She absorbed that. The full weight of it. 2 names that had been abstractions. Threats, pressures, the invisible hand behind reassignments and sealed files, and a cover story she'd had to build and live inside for a year and a half, becoming concrete and documented, and subject to the particular machinery of accountability that couldn't be stopped once it reached this stage. Not by pressure, not by sealed files, not by sending a man with a fake badge into a hospital during a blizzard. When does Solis's operation report out? Emily asked. 6 hours, Solis said. Standard post-incident reporting cycle, which means the network's domestic contacts will know about tonight's failure within the same window. They'll try to move the appointments before the warrants execute, Emily said. That's what the 6-hour window is for, Solis said. We execute before morning. Emily nodded. The decision was already made. Had been made, probably, the moment she'd picked up the badge, or the moment Kodiak had moved, or earlier than that, the moment she'd taken the Iron Ridge position and quietly confirmed the secondary cache location was still intact, and waited to see if anyone was going to do anything about what she knew. 18 months. The window had come. I need 2 things before I give the statement, she said. Solis waited. Warren Kells in East Ward Room 4. His ICP monitor is running on battery backup, and his pressure has been trending high. He needs a facility transfer before that battery drops, which is in about 25 minutes at current draw. She said it without apology, because it wasn't an apology situation. It was a patient, and he mattered. Get him moved first. Done, Solis said. What's the second? Ben comes with me to the statement facility. She looked between them. He was at Sandthorn. He has independent corroboration of the operational context that neither of your agencies fully has, and he's the one who called it by name tonight in a room full of witnesses, which means he's already in the open regardless. Reyes looked at Solis. Solis looked at Emily. He'll have to agree, Solis said. I know, Emily said. He will. She was right. When they found Venn, sitting in the corridor outside the trauma bay, back against the wall, his injured arm across his knees, not sleeping but not quite awake, the way operators rested in the small spaces between one thing and the next. He looked up when Emily crouched in front of him. She said 3 words. Sandthorn, it's time. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Tick. The transfer took 40 minutes. Warren Kells was loaded into the remaining ambulance, the one that hadn't been in the bay when the incendiary case was planted, the one kept outside during winter protocol, with Renata accompanying him, holding the portable monitor, talking to him in the low, steady tone of a nurse who understood that unconscious didn't mean unhearing. Dolores had taken over central coordination with the kind of quiet efficiency that Emily now recognized for what it had always been. Not a personality trait, but a practiced competence that had simply never been asked to operate above its usual threshold. Dr. Hall found Emily near the ambulance bay before she left. He didn't say a lot of what was probably in his head. He was a contained man, Hall, and he'd been through enough tonight to have stripped away some of the professional formality that had always been his default register with her. You caught the breathing, he said, in the first 5 minutes. The tension pneumothorax that wasn't declared yet. It was heading there, she said. I would have caught it, he said. Eventually. I know you would have, she said, and meant it. He looked at the ambulance bay doors. Are you coming back? She didn't answer immediately because the answer was genuinely complicated, and she didn't want to give him a simple version of it. I don't know yet, she said. Probably not in the same way. He nodded. The kind of nod that isn't agreement, just acknowledgement. I hear what you're saying, and I understand there's more to it than I can ask about right now. You're a good nurse, he said. Whatever else you are. She held that for a moment. It was a strange thing to be moved by, after the night she'd had, in the context of what she was walking into. But it landed. Thank you, she said. She meant that too. Tully was waiting near the exit with Kodiak. The dog looked at Emily when she approached, the ears forward, the alert that wasn't alarm, recognition, maybe, or something in her that it had been reading all night. She crouched briefly and put her hand on the dog's head. Kodiak leaned into it, just slightly. He doesn't usually do that, Tully said. I know dogs, Emily said. Yeah, Tully said. I figured you knew a lot of things. They went out into the blizzard. The cold hit like a wall, specific and absolute, the kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. The transport vehicles were running. Solus's remaining team, a DIA field vehicle that had come in behind the military helicopters, and a single unmarked sedan that Ven had looked at twice before getting into. Emily was 2 steps from the sedan door when her phone buzzed. Not a regular phone, the secondary one, the one with the number that only 4 people had, one of whom was dead and one of whom she'd just been told was alive. One new message, no name. A number she recognized from a different decade of her life. She opened it. 4 words. They know you're moving. She stopped walking. Solus was already in the lead vehicle. Reyes was at the DIA car. Ven was in the sedan. She looked at the message again. The network had been notified. Not in 6 hours. Already. Which meant the source that Solus had reevaluated, the source that had fed accurate intelligence about the hospital access while protecting the layer above it, had sent something in the last 40 minutes. While Solus was making her call, while the warrants were being confirmed, while the transfer was being coordinated, while Emily had been occupied keeping Reyes talking. She looked at the vehicles, at the route they were about to take, at the 40 miles of Alaska highway between here and the secure facility, in blizzard conditions, in the dark, with a network that had just been told they were moving. She looked at the message one more time. The sender's number was active. The message had been sent 12 minutes ago and she'd missed it because her phone had been in her coat pocket and the coat had been on a hook in the ambulance bay for the last 45 minutes while she was handling the incendiary case. 12 minutes. Solis, she said. Her voice carried. The lead vehicle window came down. Change the route, Emily said. Whatever route you filed, change it. Right now, before we move. Solis looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then she got on the radio. Reyes had gotten out of the DIA car and was walking toward Emily. What do you know? He said. She showed him the message. He looked at it, then at her, then at the phone, the secondary phone, the number, the implication of its existence. Who sent this? He said. Emily looked at the dark road disappearing into the blizzard. The same person who gave you my location, she said. The same person who was at Sandthorn. She paused. Tobias Wren just told us the route is compromised, which means either he knows it because he's still running both sides, or he knows it because the people we're about to put warrants on just made a move, and he's close enough to them to see it. Reyes said nothing. Either way, Emily said, we have a problem. The blizzard came down around them, indifferent and vast, and somewhere on a road that led north, something was waiting for a convoy that hadn't left yet. Solus rerouted in 4 minutes. She did it without asking for a full explanation. She read the message Emily held up to the window, read Emily's face, and made the call. That was the thing about Solus that Emily had been calibrating all night. The woman trusted evidence over ego, which was rarer in federal work than anyone in federal work liked to admit. The new route went west before it went north, longer by 22 miles, 2 additional highway segments, a service interchange that wasn't on standard navigation. Solus pulled it from a physical map, an actual paper map from the vehicle's door pocket, the kind nobody kept anymore except people who'd learned the hard way what happened when digital systems failed or were compromised. She marked the deviation in pen and passed it back to Reyes's vehicle and the sedan carrying Ven through the window, no radio transmission. If the route that had been filed was already in the wrong hands, the radio was a liability. Emily rode with Tully and Kodiak in the DIA vehicle. Reyes drove. Nobody talked much for the first 10 minutes. The blizzard was bad enough that driving required most of a person's attention, the visibility down to 15 feet in the stronger gusts, the road identifiable more by the reflector posts on its margins than by anything visible ahead. Kodiak was settled in the back beside Tully, head on his handler's knee, but the dog's eyes were open and moving. Not anxious. Watchful. Emily watched the road. The message from Wren sat in her coat pocket, the secondary phone screen dark now. 4 words that had shifted the geometry of the night one more time. They know you're moving. She'd been turning the question over since the parking lot. Which version of Tobias Wren had sent it? The man who had built a parallel case for 5 years, who had given a sworn deposition 8 days ago, who Solis now believed was the foundation of a legitimate prosecutorial structure, or a man who had been playing multiple sides long enough that even his warnings were instruments of something she couldn't see clearly. She didn't have the answer. She had the message and the 22 extra miles in Solis's paper map, and that would have to be enough until they arrived. They arrived. The secure facility was 46 miles from Iron Ridge Medical Center and looked from the outside like a regional land survey office. Low building, no signage that meant anything. 2 vehicles in the lot that were the particular unremarkable models that federal operations favored when they wanted to look like nobody was home. Inside it was warmer than the hospital had been for the last 2 hours, and better lit and staffed by 4 people who had been awake for longer than Emily and showed it in the specific way of people running on task rather than rest. There was a man standing near the back wall, medium height, early 40s maybe, though the gray at his temples pushed the read older. He was wearing civilian clothes, a work shirt worn at the collar, the kind of clothing that took years to acquire that particular quality of lived in rather than bought that way. His left arm had a scar below the elbow that she knew the origin of because she'd been in the same field position when it happened. Tobias Wren looked at her across the room the way people look at someone they'd filed as lost and hadn't fully allowed themselves to unfile. She crossed to him. She didn't hug him. They weren't people who did that, had never been. Some working relationships establish their language early, and it holds across years and distance. She put her hand on his forearm, the scarred one, briefly. "You're late," she said. "I was waiting for the right evidence structure," he said. His voice was the same, lower than she remembered or she'd been remembering wrong. Showing up early would have been noise. The warning tonight. The route. I had a source inside the network's domestic communication chain. When your convoy prep showed up in their traffic, I had 4 minutes. He looked at her steadily. "I know what you were thinking, both sides." I'd have thought the same thing. "Are you?" she said. "No," he said, simply, without the particular overemphasis of someone who needed to sell it. She looked at him for a moment. Read what she could read. "Okay," she said. She meant it as a provisional yes rather than a permanent conclusion, and he understood that because he'd always understood her precision with language. Solis and Reyes had come in behind her, and the specific territorial negotiation of 2 agencies in one room was already underway in the way those negotiations always ran. Posture, positioning, who stood where relative to whom, the silent cartography of institutional authority. Emily let them work it out. She'd spent enough years adjacent to that particular dynamic to know it resolved faster when the people it didn't actually involve stayed out of it. Ven had settled near the door. He'd been evaluated by one of the facility's medical staff on arrival, a field medic named Santos, who'd looked at his arm and his general condition and made the specific expression of someone who wanted to insist on rest and knew it wasn't going to happen. Emily sat down at the table in the center of the room. "Let's take the statement," she said. "Well, it took 3 hours. Not because the information was complicated. She'd been running through it in her head for 5 years. And it came out organized, sequenced, precise. It took 3 hours because the legal structure of a sworn statement at that level required repetition, clarification, the specific cross-referencing of documentation against verbal account, and because partway through the 2nd hour, the financial forensics team on a secure video link asked a set of questions about the authorization signatures that required her to walk through the operational timeline with a detail she hadn't expected to be asked for. She walked through it, She did not editorialize. She did not color the account with the weight of what it had cost her. The years, the cover, the particular loneliness of maintaining a position that nobody around you knew you were maintaining. She stated facts in the order they had occurred and let the facts carry the weight, because facts under oath are not helped by emotion and are frequently damaged by it. What she'd witnessed during Operation Sandthorn, the specific communications she'd intercepted, the financial routing she'd documented, the authorization chain she'd traced from the field level up, through 2 layers of contractor structure and into the Federal Appointments Division. What she'd recovered, physical documentation, stored in the secondary cache, at a location she gave on record for the first time. What she'd seen in the aftermath, the specific reassignments, the sealed file, the cover story she'd been handed, and the implicit threat attached to it. She named both names. She said them clearly, with their full titles and their specific roles in what she'd witnessed, and she felt the weight of saying them in a room with a federal judge on video link and 2 agency representatives and a court recorder running, and the weight was significant, and she carried it. Wren gave his corroboration after her. It was shorter. His access to the Sandthorn operation had been narrower than hers, but it filled specific gaps in the authorization chain that her account left open, and the 2 statements together were what the judge had described, before the session started, as a complete evidentiary foundation. Ven's account came last. He covered the operational intelligence piece, what his unit had been told about the Sandthorn parameters, what they'd actually encountered, the specific debrief in which they'd been told the anomalies they'd observed were classified and not to be referenced in any subsequent reporting. He was clean and direct, and he'd been holding that account for 5 years in the same way Emily had been holding hers, with the specific frustration of someone who knew something wrong had been done and had no mechanism to address it. He had one now. The judge. Her name was Honorable Patricia Dunn, and she had the look of someone who had been awake since receiving the sealed warrant request and was running entirely on the energy of a situation that mattered, reviewed the combined accounts and the documentation cross-reference, and made her statement on record at 4:17 in the morning. The sealed warrants were now active. The arrests happened at 6:41 a.m. Emily wasn't there for them. She was at the facility, on her second cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made 4 hours ago and reheated twice, sitting in the room that had been a formal proceeding space 3 hours ago and was now just a room with chairs pushed back at angles and empty cups, and the particular stillness of a space that has held something significant and is now releasing it. Solis was on the phone, had been on the phone since 4:30, coordinating what was coming. Her voice through the door was controlled and continuous, and Emily caught fragments, simultaneous, sealed until service, media protocol at completion, that told her the machinery was running and had enough momentum now that nothing short of an infrastructure failure was stopping it. Reyes had gone outside somewhere around 5. Emily could see him through the facility window, standing in the snow that was still coming down, but lighter now, the blizzard breaking up at its edges, making the slow transition from crisis weather to aftermath weather. He was on his own phone. She didn't try to read the conversation. Wren was across the room, sitting in a chair that was slightly apart from the others, the way he'd always positioned himself. Enough separation to think, not enough to be absent. He was looking at nothing in particular with the look of someone running a long calculation to its end. "What happens to you now?" she said. He looked up. "Debriefed, probably relocated. Consulting arrangement maybe if the oversight team wants continuity." He paused. "You?" She'd been thinking about that. Had been thinking about it since she walked out of Iron Ridge Medical Center's ambulance bay into the snow, past the orange equipment case she'd disarmed sitting in a drift by the door, past the vehicles and the tactical team and the particular wreckage of a night that had broken things open that had been sealed for too long. "I don't know exactly," she said, "but not hiding." "No," he agreed, "not anymore." The hiding had been its own kind of cost that she hadn't fully accounted until it was ending. 18 months of a quieter life, and it hadn't been terrible. Dolores and Hall's respect that built slowly and didn't announce itself, and the work itself, which was real work that mattered to real people, regardless of what else she was or had been. She'd been a nurse. Genuinely. That wasn't nothing, but she'd been a nurse the way someone keeps a light on in a house they're not sure they're allowed to go back to. The light was on now. The door was open. She didn't know the floor plan of what was on the other side, but she wasn't going to know it from standing outside. At 6:41, Solis came through the door and said, "Both in custody." Not dramatically. Flatly, the way field people relay field outcomes. Emily looked at her. Deputy Director Harlan Preuss, National Infrastructure Security Board, arrested at his residence in Virginia at 6:41 Eastern Time, Solis said. Senior Appointments Officer Greta Vale, Military Contracting Oversight Division, arrested at her office building in Washington at 6:41. Simultaneous service, as coordinated. She paused. 8 counts each under the sealed warrants: conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of federal proceedings, misuse of classified authorization authority, and 4 additional counts related to financial crimes documented by the forensics team. Emily said nothing for a moment. She'd been waiting for this information for 5 years. She'd imagined how it would feel. The specific way she'd imagined it varied by the year and the mood, and the particular quality of the silence in whatever cover location she was maintaining. Sometimes it was relief. Sometimes it was something harder and more complex. Sometimes she hadn't been able to imagine it at all because it had required a kind of hope she'd been careful not to carry. What she actually felt at 6:42 in a facility outside Vantara, Alaska, was something quieter than any of those versions. Not anticlimactic, nothing about the night had been that, but grounded, the shape of a thing finally matching the space that had been held for it. "Good," she said. One word. It was enough. Ven, from across the room. "The media protocol you mentioned." Solis looked at him. "Public statement at 9 a.m. Eastern. Justice Department, joint with DOD. The charges are public at that point, names included." She glanced at Emily. "Your name will be referenced as a key witness, not your current location, not your service details beyond what the statement requires, but your name." Emily thought about Dolores reading a headline, about Hall, about Renata, about the way the hospital had looked at her in the amber emergency lighting and recalibrated who she was in real time. "That's fine," she said. It was more than fine. It was the specific thing that couldn't be replicated by a private resolution or a quiet settlement or a classified outcome that nobody ever saw. The public version, the version that lived outside her own head and outside sealed files and outside the institutional structures that had been deciding for 5 years what the truth was allowed to be. The truth was allowed to be itself now. She was back at Iron Ridge Medical Center by 9:15, not permanently, not in the same capacity. She came back because Renata had texted her at 7:30, not the hospital phone, her personal number, which Renata had never used before, to say that Warren Kells had been transferred successfully and was stable at Vantara Regional, and that the East Wing generator had been fixed by a maintenance crew that had apparently materialized at 6 a.m., with a work order that nobody at the hospital had filed but nobody was complaining about. And because Dolores had called at 8, not to explain anything, just, "When you have a minute, if you're coming back through." She came back through. The hospital looked different in daylight, specifically in the thin, low, pale light of an Alaskan morning after a blizzard, when the snow had stopped and the sky was the particular flat white that preceded clearing, and everything was very still and very clean, in the way only a world freshly covered with snow can look, which is temporary and does not survive the first footstep, but is something while it lasts. The East Wing was running on full power. The trauma bay had been cleaned and reset. There was a federal incident tape across the South Ambulance Bay. It would be there for days, until the scene documentation was complete. But the rest of the building was operational and quiet and smelled like every hospital she'd ever been in, which was its own particular combination of antiseptic and floor cleaner, and something underneath that she'd never been able to name, and that she associated, despite everything, with the specific work of trying to keep people alive. Dolores was at the nursing station. She looked up when Emily came in, looked at her for a long moment without saying anything, which was unusual for Dolores, who had an opinion on most things and shared it on a reasonable schedule. 9 a.m. news, Dolores said. I watched it on my phone. Okay, Emily said. They said your name. I know. Dolores looked at her hands on the desk. You've been here 18 months. You showed up with a reference letter from a regional health network and a list of certifications, and you were very quiet, and you refilled IVs, and you caught a tension pneumothorax that Hall would have caught 5 minutes later, and you never once made anybody feel small. Emily waited. I should have seen more, Dolores said. Not accusatory. Honest, in the particular way of a person who holds themselves to a standard. You saw a nurse, Emily said. That's what I showed you. Is it what you were? Emily thought about that. The real version, not the diplomatic version. It's what I was here, she said. It's also not the whole picture. Both things are true. Dolores accepted that with the nod of someone who'd lived long enough to know that people were usually more than one thing, and the categories we put them in were mostly for our own convenience. Paul wants to talk to you, she said. He's in his office. He's been in his office since 6, and I think he's rewritten whatever he wants to say about 4 times. Emily found him at his desk with a cold cup of coffee and a notepad that had been written on and crossed out to the point where the top sheet was mostly ink. He looked up when she knocked on the open door and had the expression of a man who had been very competent in a crisis and was now slightly at a loss in the quieter thing that followed it. Sit down, he said. She sat. I looked up Operation Sandthorn, he said, as much as is publicly available, which as of this morning is more than it was yesterday. He paused. You were a combat medic attached to special operations units for 6 years. Approximately. You have a service record that, from what I can read, is... He stopped. I don't have the language for what it is. I don't have the context. I know medicine, and I know this hospital, and I know that you caught something last night that mattered, and I've been trying to figure out how to say what I want to say without making it smaller than it is or larger than it needs to be. Say it the way it is, she said. He looked at her. You were the best clinical instinct in this building. Every night you worked here. I didn't use you right because I filed you wrong, and that's on me, and I'm sorry for it. It landed differently than she'd expected, not because it was large, it wasn't in the context of the night, but because it was specific. He wasn't apologizing for doubting her in a crisis. He was apologizing for the 18 months before the crisis, for the observation assignments and the IV restocks, and the quiet dismissal built into being the nurse everyone overlooked. Thank you, she said. She meant it simply and without irony, and he accepted it the same way. At 10:40, Tully found her in the hospital's small exterior courtyard, a concrete square with a bench and 2 dead potted plants that nobody had replaced since October, where she'd gone to stand in the clearing weather and do nothing for a few minutes, which she'd been putting off for approximately 9 hours. Kodiak was with him. The dog came to her immediately, pushing its head against her hand, and she held it there. We're moving out at noon, Tully said. The team. Medevac up to Anchorage, then transport. He paused. Ben wanted me to tell you. He'll be filing a supplementary operational report when he's back, the kind that goes to the unit's own IG chain. He said you'd know what that means. She did. It meant there would be an internal military record of what had been done to the Sandthorn team, what the reassignments had really been. It was a different document from the federal case, running through a different structure, and it would take longer to produce its outcomes as institutional accountability inside the military moved at its own pace, which was slower than civilian prosecution and sometimes, eventually, more thorough. Tell him thank you, she said. Tully looked at her for a moment with the particular candor of someone who doesn't spend time on unnecessary preamble. What are you going to do? She'd been asked this twice already today. Her answer was slightly more formed now than it had been. There's a joint federal military medical oversight program, she said. Solis mentioned it this morning. It's attached to the Inspector General chain that Wren worked with. They need personnel with clinical backgrounds who can evaluate the medical dimensions of federal cases. Supply chains, institutional fraud, the gap between what military medical operations report and what actually happens in the field. She looked at the dead potted plant for a moment. It's not a hospital. No, Tully said. But it's the same thing, she said. You look at what's actually happening instead of what the paperwork says is happening, and you figure out the gap, and you close it. She paused. I've been doing that my whole career in different forms. You gonna take it? I'm going to think about it for more than 4 minutes, she said. But yes. Tully nodded. He looked at Kodiak. The dog was still leaning into Emily's hand, calm, the working alertness powered down to whatever the resting state of a dog who has done exactly what it was trained for looks like. He doesn't trust easily, Tully said. Takes him 4 or 5 encounters to extend that to most people. He trusted the right things last night, Emily said. Yeah, Tully said. He did. She crouched and put both hands on the dog's face and looked at it directly, which most people didn't do with working animals and which Kodiak accepted from her without pulling back. Good dog, she said. It was inadequate as a statement of the full account. It was also exactly right. Isha. The federal press statement went out at 9 a.m. Eastern, which was 5 a.m. Vantara time, but the second wave coverage hit the national outlets by noon. Local, and by mid-afternoon it was the kind of story that had enough documented detail and named charges and public record warrant information to sustain itself without needing interpretation. Deputy Director Harlan Proust, arraigned in federal district court in Virginia, facing 8 counts including conspiracy and obstruction of federal proceedings. Senior Appointments Officer Greta Vale, arraigned in the same district on matching charges plus 3 additional financial fraud counts that the forensics work had developed overnight. Both denied bail on the basis of flight risk, which the judge had granted without significant deliberation, given the nature of the charges and the evidence presented. A key witness, the statement said, had provided foundational testimony that had been central to the issuance of the warrants. Emily Vasquez, former Special Operations Combat Medic, currently staff nurse at Iron Ridge Medical Center in Vantara, Alaska. She read it on her phone, standing in the hospital parking lot in the pale afternoon light with the snow packed in ridges around the lot's perimeter and the sky doing the thing Alaskan skies did when weather moved through, turning a particular deep blue at the edges that was different from any blue she'd seen anywhere else. Her name in a public document, connected to her real service record, in the context of an outcome rather than a concealment. It was a strange thing to look at. Not painful. She'd expected it to feel like exposure, like the specific vulnerability of a cover stripped away, and it didn't feel that way. It felt more like a window opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. Renata called at 2:15. She'd heard the news coverage on the hospital's break room television and had questions Emily could hear her trying to organize before she'd said them. The breathing thing, Renata said. The first night I worked with you, I made you redo the intake assessment because I thought you'd skipped steps. I hadn't, Emily said. I know, Renata said. I know. A pause. I was wrong. You were doing your job, Emily said. Don't carry it. The line was quiet for a moment. Are you coming back? Renata asked. Not permanently, Emily said. I have something else to do. She paused. But I'll be here a few more days for the scene documentation, and, Renata, you're a good nurse. Don't let anyone file you wrong either. She meant it. She'd meant it since the night Renata had carried the portable monitor through a dark corridor to a man who needed it, without being asked, knowing it was going to be heavy, and the battery was limited, and it mattered anyway. The things that matter don't announce themselves. They just get done by whoever is paying attention. Quote. 3 weeks later, Proust and Vale were indicted on the full charge set. The 8 original counts expanded to 14 as the financial forensics work completed and the sealed warrants produced further document recovery. The network investigation produced 11 additional arrests across 4 states, connecting the domestic contractor structure to operations in 3 countries and generating a case file that the Justice Department described, in its public statement, as among the most significant national security fraud prosecutions in a decade. Callum was charged federally. The 2 secondary operatives from the hospital were charged federally. The aircraft that had been turned by military intercept, and its pilot, who had landed at an airfield 200 miles east when the intercept became unavoidable, were connected to the same contractor network and added to the indictment stack. Warren Kells was transferred to a veterans medical facility in Anchorage and began a recovery that his doctors described as better than projected, which his chart had always suggested was possible if the intracranial pressure management held through the critical window. It had held. Renata had made sure of it in the dark with a portable monitor and 40 minutes of battery. Dario Ven's supplementary operational report was filed through the unit's IG chain and triggered a formal military review of the Sandthorn reassignments. That review would take 8 months and produce findings that were partially public and partially classified, but its existence was on the record. And its existence meant there was a document that said plainly, in institutional language, what had been done to a team that had done its job correctly and been scattered for the crime of seeing too clearly. Tobias Wren took the consulting arrangement Solis had described. He and Emily had dinner once, in Anchorage, before she left for the Oversight Program's orientation facility in Virginia. It was a long dinner, and most of it wasn't about Sandthorn, because they'd said what needed to be said about Sandthorn in sworn statements, and it didn't require repetition. They talked about other things, the work they were going to do, the specific problems and the gap between field medicine and institutional accountability that neither of them had been able to address from a position of cover. The conversation had the quality of two people planning rather than two people surviving, which was different in a way that took her a few minutes to identify and then felt obvious. She'd been surviving for a long time. She drove to the airport in the early morning when the Alaskan sky was doing its specific blue again, and she thought about Dolores at the nursing station and Hall in his office with the crossed-out notepad and Renata carrying a monitor through the dark and Ven watching the East Corridor door before anyone else knew to watch it, and Kodiak, who had known before all of them, whose instinct had been trusted when it would have been easier to dismiss it. The quiet ones. The ones who were filed wrong and did their work anyway and waited for the moment when the thing they knew became visible to the room. She'd spent 18 months being small on purpose, and even in that smallness, she'd been unable to stop doing the work, catching the breathing that was wrong, knowing the road was closed, counting exits. She'd been built for this, not for hiding, for the work. The real work, the kind that asked everything you had and was larger than any one position or cover or title or the way someone looked at you when you walked into a room. The plane lifted off over Vantara, and the hospital was visible for a moment through the window. Small from altitude, white-roofed under the last of the season's snow. Ordinary-looking in the way that buildings always look from above, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened inside them. She looked at it until it disappeared. Then she turned forward, and whatever was next was already starting, and she was already equal to it, and she'd been equal to it all along. The women who are dismissed, who are filed in the wrong category, who are told to stay in their lane and do their work and be quiet. They are not diminished by that dismissal. They are, in the end, defined by what they do with it, by whether they close the distance between who they're told they are and who they actually are, by whether they trust their own instinct when everyone around them is still catching up. The world is full of Emilys, full of people who know the breathing is wrong, who see the badge that doesn't read right, who understand that the dog is never wrong about the thing it's pointed at. They don't need to be louder. They need to be seen.